Listen to Rugby Direct every week to get the lowdown on all you need to know from the rugby world. Rugby Direct has it all. All Blacks, Black Ferns, NPC and more. Listen to Rugby Direct, powered by News Talk ZB on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts. It's time for all the attitude, all the opinion, all the information, all the debate. Now, the Leighton Smith Podcast, powered by News Talk ZB and nzherald.co.nz.
Welcome to Podcast 108 for the 28th of April. Andrew Bolt, best known in New Zealand for his Sky News Australia program, outspoken, unafraid of authority, and a journalist of 4 years' experience. He has battled Victoria's hate speech laws in court. We discuss New Zealand's Five Eyes involvement, we discuss hate speech, and Jacinda Ardern's plans for new laws. Now, the guest column at the back end of 108 concerns post-truth and the workplace. And just in case you're unsure of what post-truth is, we give you full definition. And, of course, Mrs. Producer and the mailroom. And by default, the mailroom is where we begin this week. Well, what I'm about to deal with emanated from the mailroom. A couple of weeks back, I read an email from George. George wrote on child abuse. Is it any wonder that our counselling services are such a growth industry? Our younger generation is filled with anxiety, depression and outrage. Once again, we have large gatherings of our youth spewing forth slogans and demands about impending climate doom. And that's all I will read from his original submission. But there's a follow-up. It seems that not only did I read it and people heard it, but his correspondence somehow found its way onto Facebook. So more people heard it. And he got some feedback. So he's written this: Climate Change Facts and Fiction. In response to feedback on this, it's important to note that Mother Nature is in charge. I'm not familiar with what is happening in Miami, but similar forces will be in play as exist elsewhere. Inundation of the Maldives and Pacific Islands has been mentioned as being a result of sea level rise. In our part of the world, our few Pacific neighbours who are under such threat are the Tokelau Islands and a small coastal area in Fiji. In both cases, the very real threat of inundation has proved to be mainly due to land subsidence. We visited the beautiful Maldives a couple of years ago and were immediately struck by the huge building boom that's underway with high-rise hotels under construction. No doubt the virus has now had a negative impact, but at that time the growth of their tourism industry was well in evidence. They were obviously not feeling immediately threatened by inundation. This widespread group includes hundreds of tiny islands that are very low lying, and any evidence of significant sea level changes would be plain to see. It is accepted as fact that sea levels have been rising for centuries. During the last 100 years, annual increases are recorded in millimetres and fractions of millimetres, with little more than 1 millimetre in earlier years and an increase in the 1990s to a little over 2 millimetres. Even at this higher rate, it would take about 1,500 years, that's 1,500 years, to reach the catastrophic 3 metres of sea level rise that we were told to expect to have occurred by 2010. That bold prediction was presented to us in the 1980s and did nothing to advance the credibility of scientific modelling. When it comes to major flooding events, many factors are often involved, and it's important that all elements are considered rather than surrendering to one popular theory. Heavy rainfall, low atmospheric pressure, driving wind, spring tides, siltation, inadequate draining systems, historical subsidence, etc. can all play their part. A bit more than a year ago in New Zealand, we experienced a storm that impacted 2 low-lying communities at opposite ends of the country. The resulting damage was devastating. The key factor in one was the recently harvested forestry area nearby, which produced heavy siltation and mountains of trash. The other was due to grossly inadequate drainage systems that had been neglected for far too long. The resulting banner headline the next day announced "Rising Seas," with accompanying photos of the aftermath. This was completely dishonest, of course, and sea level did not get mentioned in the news article at all. Important factors to remember are that sensationalism sells newspapers and alarmism opens the door to political opportunism. Now, in a separate note, George, who happens to be a farmer, by the way, George wrote, "What frustrates me the most is the ever-widening gap that lies between climate science and climate politics. My other frustration is the inexplicable lack of pushback from our farming leaders who seem to just roll over and accept the nonsense that pasture-based farming is our biggest polluter. If you'd like, he says, I can send you a piece I wrote to show that ruminant farming is not only carbon neutral, but can be shown to be carbon positive. So George has got it in for the alarmists, and quite rightly so. Now, the reason I decided to utilise his correspondence at the beginning of this podcast is because there is news of another sort that George will appreciate. So will I. So will lots of you. And hopefully we can put it to good use. There is a new book. It's not yet released. It gets released on May 4. The book is called Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters. The author is Stephen Koonin, former Undersecretary for Science. By the way, he's a physicist. Former Undersecretary for Science, US Department of Energy, under the Obama administration. Now, I have a copy of the book, and the interview with Steve Koonin is booked and will be on the podcast in a couple of weeks. And just one more thing. I want to congratulate George. He's put a lot of work into this, and he will undoubtedly put more into it because he feels very strongly about it. If only there were more Georges in the farming community and out of it, we might make more headway with common sense in this country. From Wet and Forget come the most wonderful cleaning products. Shower Witch takes the hard work out of cleaning your shower and bathroom. Simple to apply, no aggressive chemicals, it's biodegradable and smells like a vanilla milkshake. Then for those hard water calcium deposits you just can't get off, you need Tiger's Paw. Tiger's Paw works when nothing else will. Listen to what one happy customer from Wet and Forget has to say. Jay Smith, I popped into my local Wet and Forget store in Rangiora today to pick up Tiger's Paw and give it a go as the last-ditch attempt to remove the awful water spots from our showers. An hour after buying it, my showers are looking almost as good as new. We can see through the glass again, and the job was super easy. Really happy with your product. Highly recommend Tiger's Paw. Thank you. So it's Shower Witch for cleaning your shower and bathroom, and it's Tiger's Paw for removing the hard water calcium deposits on your shower door. Wet and Forget. Great range of products that really work. 0800 30 3000. You can order online at wetandforget.co.nz and 22 stores around the country. The subject of Five Eyes has been headline stuff over the last few days. For very good reason. New Zealand is taking a free ride. At least some people think that. New Zealand is taking a free ride, a bludgeoning ride, on the back of its neighbours and the back of its Five Eyes partners. The Australian had a rather brittle headline and editorial that covered it off fairly well. Andrew Bolt, well-known journalist and commentator for Sky News Australia, writer for the Herald Sun in Melbourne. Andrew Bolt wrote a piece. New Zealand has left Five Eyes in the lurch over China. He gets less kind as the article goes on. Andrew, it's great to have you on the podcast. I do appreciate it. You feel quite savage toward New Zealand at this point of time over this?
No, I love New Zealand. Love New Zealand. Beautiful country, beautiful people, just a very stupid foreign minister. That's the problem.
Why restrict it to the foreign minister?
Well, look, it's probably not her alone. Jacinda Ardern's there in the mix. But I was struck by the fact that Foreign Minister Mahuta was also quoting an imaginary sea monster as her inspiration for the way she was dealing with China. I thought that takes a special level of new age woke stupidity to do that.
It does. The fact that the government has taken this stance is not unusual for New Zealand. If we look at the history of the country, well, the history of the relations between both countries, and keeping in mind that I came from one to the other. When I arrived here, Muldoon was Prime Minister, and the first thing that I was confronted with, as far as he was concerned, and I got on with him very well actually, was that he and Malcolm Fraser didn't get on, and there was quite a bit of standoffishness at the time. There are other things along the way. now there is some considerable pushback from this country over the 501s that are being returned to New Zealand because they're undesirable in Australia. So we've had our issues. Apples too might be mentioned at this particular point.
Sure, there's a lot of niggles between various countries. A lot of Australians didn't get on with Malcolm Fraser either. Wouldn't say Piggy Muldoon was on his own for that one. But about the returning 501s and all that kind of stuff, look, the percentage of Maoris in our jails is really quite extraordinary. If you want to send some of them back, that's one thing. But it's like having, France and England in 1939 having an argument about, cognac exports, how dare you, and your sausages stink, and refusing on those grounds to turn their joint attention to the greatest threat then to peace in the world, which is Germany. We can't let some dispute about whether we're returning New Zealand criminals or shouldn't be or whatever interfere with the fact that New Zealand has itself an interest in joining the developed world, the democracy of this world, in confronting China, which is the greatest threat to war in our region that we know of. That's been in probably our lifetime.
Would it not be fair to say that whether you view it that way or not depends on your politics? Somebody said here that the objections to New Zealand's action has come from right-wing commentators in Britain and Australia, really, not from the government.
Seriously? Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, is a right-wing guy as well, seriously. Joe Biden is right-wing. I mean, give us a break. Our Labor Party is just as concerned. I mean, you know what it really is? It's the New Zealand politicians thinking they can sneak out from under. They can think, well, we'll leave it to other democracies to do the fighting. We'll pick up the loose change that spills out of China's pockets, the little rewards and enhanced free trade agreement that China bestows on New Zealand for being a good little puppy, a good example, not like that terrible Australia and other countries, by the way. And so it's working in a double sin, in a sense. You're breaking up the joint effort to confront a dictatorship, which might be the best way to avert a war in our region, right? You're not just doing that, but you're serving to the waverers as an example of the rewards that come from shutting your mouth and not confronting dictatorship by kowtowing. I think that's really embarrassing. I'm speaking to you on Anzac Day. For heaven's sake, New Zealand once had a different reputation. For all you said about New Zealand's past, the NZ in Anzac comes from New Zealand.
New Zealand has changed somewhat considerably, I think, more so than Australia. Although I do want to get onto that matter down the line a bit, because there is some questions I've got for you. But the Foreign Minister, your Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, who was here, of course, for 3 days, in conversation with the Prime Minister and others, she doesn't seem to have... Well, I'll rephrase that. She seems to have found it reasonably agreeable that New Zealand should stand on its own 2 feet and make its own decisions. Do you think that that's what's been said behind the scenes with closed doors?
No, not really. Look, she said the diplomatic thing. She's our chief diplomat. But I noticed that Nanaia Mahuta, after their meeting, came out and was backpedaling furiously. Before the meeting, she said, we've got a Five Eyes security agreement, right? And that is Canada, New Zealand, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand sharing intelligence against common foes, right? That's the agreement. And recently, the Five Eyes partners, ex-New Zealand though, have been issuing joint statements criticising, for one, China's arrest of human rights and democracy activists in Hong Kong, and also that whitewash of a World Health Organization report into how the coronavirus started, one that was disowned even by the World Health Organization boss himself as he was launching it the very day. In both cases, Mahuta refused to sign both of them. And then she said, we're very uncomfortable. I'm uncomfortable, she said, with the way that the Five Eyes Agreement is being used. Then, after the meeting, she said, well, I don't think the Five Eyes Agreement should be used to make a joint stand on absolutely everything, which was never the idea, We don't do it for absolutely everything. So I think there was some considerable backpedaling by the woman herself. But obviously, we're trying to keep New Zealand in the tent. All we're asking is that New Zealand do what so many democracies have been doing and confronting China, rather than leave the struggles and the pain to everyone else, allowing countries like Australia to be picked off, which I think is just pig-headed, it's just ignorant. It's just not in your own interests. As you know, you can feed the crocodile everyone else in the boat, but in the end, the crocodile will come for you too.
That's true. However, let me just mount one more, shall we say, hurdle to the discussion. That is that New Zealand is more dependent on China, I think, than anybody else. More dependent on China than Australia by far. More dependent than the United States and more dependent than Canada. And while New Zealand's a little country, of course, and therefore the amounts involved are infinitesimal, if you're talking about America and even Australia, New Zealand still is very dependent on China. So by taking advantage of this particular situation, which some argue is what New Zealand is doing, one could, in the domestic market, lay claim to being very sensible.
Well, fine, if you want to say, look, China's bought us, fine, say it. Just say, listen, the reason we're going along with this genocidal dictatorship that's locked up 1 million Muslims, that's crushing democracy in Hong Kong, that's threatening to go to war in Taiwan maybe in 5 or 6 years, that has got businessmen like Canadian businessmen, Australian journalists imprisoned as hostages, that has started to say, the reason we're going along there, we're bought and sold, right? We're just doing it for the money. Not the principle. We're just too scared. But then say so. Fine, get your foreign minister out there saying, listen, we're actually gutless and we put all our eggs in this one basket. And it doesn't matter if China commits genocide, we'll still be good buddies with them. We'll pretend to be the honest broker and we'll criticise Australia rather than New Zealand in any dispute. You do that. If you think that's honourable, you go and do that. I don't know how long it'll last. I mean, you're foolish to put all your eggs in one basket, particularly when that basket's held by a dictatorship. That threatens, wants world domination, actually says so. It's dictator for life. President Xi Jinping says he wants China to be the dominant power. So if you want to go that way, fine. I just wonder what will happen when, the music stops, New Zealand's left without a chair. Who's going to look then for help? Australia will probably, I don't know where we'll be then. It's going to come crawling to us. I don't know. I just think it's not principled. It's not wise. But if New Zealand wants to make the argument that, well, at least it's good for the money for now, you go and do that.
Well, it's an argument that I've mounted too with people in discussion, that you've got to pull your weight under circumstances like the arrangements that we have, the backgrounds that we have, the cultures that we have, albeit that they vary a little. But they vary.
When people use that culture argument, I saw Mahuta do that when she's saying, talking about, got to respect that Chinese dragon, like she wanted people to respect the Maori Tanawa, it's ludicrous stuff. Where did these people get this stuff from? Anyway, that somehow, it's a Chinese tradition to be monstered by a dictatorship. That's the Chinese way. What an insult to the Chinese people. What an insult to the dissidents that have been locked up. What an insult to the Christians that have been jailed and the democracy activists. And what an insult to Taiwan. There's a country of 25 million Chinese who are firmly Democrats. There's nothing, inherently cultural about China having to have a dictatorship. Guys, these are predominantly older men, zealots, communist zealots, tyrants who think they know better than 1 billion other of their countrymen. And New Zealand should not be in the business of normalising that and saying it's just a cultural difference. I mean, honestly, the whole of this makes me think, thank God that China didn't have the trading relationship with Adolf Hitler in 1939 that it has with China now, because otherwise it would be excusing the concentration camps, the extermination of the Jews and everything by saying, well, look, at least they're buying our cabbage for all that sauerkraut, so we can't speak up, and we'll just criticise Britain for daring to stand up against them. I mean, please, see it in the context.
If you want an example of that, the American media, particularly a couple of newspapers, during that period that you were talking about, were very quiet on the goings-on in Germany.
Absolutely.
At that
Absolutely.
particular
How
time
shameful.
in the early 40s. And they haven't. And
do you want to be the person when the history is written that we say some future well-known broadcaster and podcast host then cites as an example of moral shame and cowardice? I wouldn't want to. I mean, I'd be I wouldn't want to be Mahuta right now. Not the way she's going in the history books.
Well, fortunately, you're not.
Unfortunately, I'm not.
Yes.
Join Brian Waddle and Jeremy Coney each week as they discuss and dissect all the latest news from the cricketing world. New Zealand's best cricket podcast, On the Front Foot.
Do you think England bowled well at him? I sensed early on he struggled against the short ball.
As soon as he got going and he realised the ball was moving, the trademark use of the crease, coming over, we haven't seen that before, you and I.
All the big issues, all the big names, On the Front Foot. Listen and follow on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts. News Talk ZB. Go directly inside the game with Rugby Direct. Listen each week to get the latest from the rugby world. Rugby Direct is the podcast for real rugby fans. Every angle, every moment, every opinion with Rugby Direct, home for all things rugby. Call yourself a real rugby fan? Follow it on iHeartRadio or wherever you get your podcasts. Rugby Direct, powered by News Talk ZB.
But a very good geopolitical commentator said to me, and a group of people that he was addressing at a function, one day he said, you're going to have to make a choice between China and America. Do you think that day is approaching?
I wouldn't want to phrase it like that. One day you're going to have to choose between democracy and dictatorship. One day you're going to have to choose between freedom and authoritarianism, between human rights and oppression. America happens to be the most powerful ally in that fight, the one that's got the most guns and all that. You've virtually mothballed your Air Force, so what are you good for? At some stage, someone's going to have to do the fighting. You're going to have to choose which side of the principle you're on, and of course then whose army you'd like to help win. I think that is very close. I mean, the American head of the Pacific Fleet, an admiral, gave evidence in Congress only a month or two ago. He predicted potentially China would try to invade Taiwan, so dictatorship invading a democracy, within 5-6 years. Now, I don't know if that's true, but I do know that if you want to avoid that potential and the vortex of war in which so many countries risk being sucked in, you have to show a united front. And you can't, by winking and nodding and picking up Chinese gold from the street and, putting up your head to be patted by China, you can't divide the opposition to what's happening and give China reason to believe that the world lacks the guts to stand up to it because it's divided. It has to be a united front. And that's why countries like New Zealand are such useful idiots to China. That's why China and its propaganda units, like the Global Times, are actually praising New Zealand in print and saying, look, Australia, the New Zealand way is the way to go. I think that's a really scary sight. I mean, you just can't afford to have that.
Well, you beat me to the Global Times. I was heading in that direction. The Trade Minister, New Zealand's Trade Minister, Damien O'Connor,
there you go.
and the comments that he made with regard to how Australia should follow New Zealand in its approach to China.
Show more respect.
How was that heard across the Tasman?
Well, like the blatherings of an idiot. I mean, seriously. Again, I go back. I mean, I really see China in so many ways, through its ethnic cleansing, etc., its religious persecution, its jailing of democracy, its absurd, B-grade movie villain threats. An analogy with Hitler's Germany in the 1930s, right? I really see it as that. And then when put that in a context, you really think in 1939, the Trade Minister of New Zealand would say, show Hitler more respect. And we got to show exactly what do we have to show? What's the respect due to the dictator for life of a dictatorship like China? Exactly what respect am I supposed to show? I mean, what a fool.
Well,
I'd like to see, has he been in public and said, oh, listen, China, show respect to Australia. Stop punishing it for standing up for freedom of speech and for against the theft of the South China Sea, issues which affect New Zealand as well, and for demanding an independent inquiry into how the coronavirus started. New Zealanders have died from that virus, and New Zealand still hasn't issued a public statement saying the World Health Organization investigation into that was rigged and stupid and a complete whitewash and must be done again. It's like, oh, you can kill New Zealanders with your virus, the way you handled it, maybe even the way you created the virus. You can do all that. Doesn't matter. We won't say anything. You know, a few New Zealanders, what does that count? We got our trade with China to look after.
Where it goes from here will be very interesting. I want to expand the conversation into a different area, that of free speech. And it's a matter that's getting a great deal of attention and publicity all over the English-speaking world, if not elsewhere, but certainly in the Five Eyes world, if you want. And the Free Speech Coalition in New Zealand on the 16th of April published the following. The Free Speech Coalition is shocked with a previously secret cabinet paper reported on today by Newsroom revealing the government wants to jail people for up to 3 years for hate speech, including that which targets political opinion. The Free Speech Coalition spokesman, Dr. David Cummin, said if the reporting is accurate, the use of insulting language against a political party, ideology or religion, to the degree it is seen to be inciting hatred, could see you jailed. These proposed measures are chilling. They go far further than the recommendations of the Royal Commission into the Christchurch terror attacks. They are the sort of laws used in theocracies and dictatorships. Not for introduction in a free and democratic society, the proposals are a call to arms for people who value free speech. The Free Speech Coalition will be regathering to fight them and call for New Zealanders to join the campaign. You have had your own issues with free speech and with the laws of the country. What is your initial reaction to what I just quoted you?
Well, I think it's just so sad. I mean, it's a slide into, we're all becoming kind of China, really, aren't we? A slide into the demonisation of debate and of language, with people jailed for what they say rather than for what they do. And more into the point, people are jailed for the offence that some people choose to take and how they interpret hate speech. What is hate speech? Well, we've seen, in fact, attempts, particularly in Australia, but also in Britain, to say the preachings of Christianity. That's hate speech. I mean, all that hatred for sinners, for heaven's sake, to lock them up. And eventually, of course, it'll turn to Islam as well, because there's some hate speech going there. And look, this is just absurd. It is a kind of judgment that is handed down by those in power against those they don't like. Hate speech is what you hate. It's not necessarily what people actually want to install. And what else is a debate? But, if I say someone's saying something evil, people say, well, that's a hateful thing to say. But what if they are saying something evil? You've got to be able to have this debate, to be able to thrash out ideas without fear that you'll be in the clink. I mean, it's just so absurd. It is just so dangerous. There was a time, of course, when people of the left, the kind of people that now propose this sort of stuff, they used to think, they were real champions for free speech then, because the same sort of antagonism towards hate speech was used again to silence them. Now they want to silence everyone else. It's just a joke. But more than a joke, it's actually quite sinister. Sinister
and very serious.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Once you introduce a law, you then have the ability to expand it. And the restrictions...
But not only that, the judges have an ability to expand it in their definition. I mean, you were born in Melbourne. Let me tell you, the first people to be whacked by Victoria's race and religious vilification laws. Now, when you put it like that, hatred, vilification, I'm against that. Of course we're going to need laws for that, But it's all in the definition, The very first people were two Christian pastors sued and convicted, eventually it was overturned on appeal, thank God, sued and convicted for simply quoting from the Quran, Quranic teachings on jihad. And one of the things held against them by the then judge in the primary decision was that they made their audience laugh by quoting the Quran. And they were convicted. Can you believe that? Another prosecution was a witch who in prison who was offended that a Salvation Army preacher had tried to convert her to Christianity with little pamphlets. I mean, seriously, the Archbishop of Hobart was dragged in before the Tasmanian Discrimination Commission for quoting the Bible about gays. I mean, seriously.
Tell me something. How do you think we got to this particular point from where we were? Let's go back. You picked the time, 30, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. How did we get to the point where we are now so easily abused or claimed to be abused? How sensitive we have become.
Well, we can't mythologise the past, because there were also, Spanish Inquisition, Galileo locked up for saying that the sun didn't revolve around the earth, all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's been intolerance all the way. People in power don't like being contradicted, and they think it's almost a sin to contradict their magnificent self. Now, I think it was true that in the 60s and all that, when it was basically conservative forces in power, people on the left who then lead the cultural debates, tend to lead the cultural debates, they were all dead against censorship, dead against censorship because it tended to be used against them. Now it's the left in charge, basically, holding the cultural ramparts. Now they're all for censorship. And conservatives are generally too meek and mild and scared and disorganised and disunited to actually complain about this much, and then it's all on the grounds of religion or something, so you look hateful. That's been the most cunning use of excuses of censorship. We're against hate. Who wants to be for hate? So suddenly you're on the back foot straight off. You're a homophobe, or you hate Muslims or something like that. And you think, for heaven's sake. And most people put their head down, and so this stuff tends to go through on the voice, with no one really daring to speak up.
Who did you call a patronising, supercilious, racist git?
Did I say that? There's a wide field. I can't guess.
Well, let me quote you. I only found this just a short while ago. It might seem unusual to take a stand for a bloke who has called you a patronising, supercilious, racist git, when that very same man has just been prosecuted for race hate speech. But the conviction of Andrew Bolt ought to raise alarm bells for all who believe in freedom of expression. However much you disagree with Bolt, the hate speech law under which he was prosecuted is more offensive than he is. It was written by Julian Assange.
I've been thinking sometime I might have to have another look at my attitude towards Julian Assange over the times.
It's a lengthy article. Well, when I say lengthy, it's 3 foolscap pages, and he goes full on defending you and the situation. Why don't you give us a very brief of what you went through?
Oh, it was just awful. I mean, we are seeing increasingly, I think it's now beyond dispute, we've seen it in America. It's always safer to discuss these things in America because they have laws defending free speech. Yeah. People identifying as of another race for advantage, for grants, for this, for that. Now, I didn't say that was happening here. I just said that people who had a choice to identify as just a human being or part white or part not white were choosing to identify solely as Aboriginal instead. And there's certain benefits that tended to flow with this, not necessarily that was what motivated them. Well, this is apparently hate speech. I mean, it's just so extraordinary, except now, of course, no one dares say boo to the fact. Well, I do, but maybe a couple of others, but most people don't dare say boo to the fact that our most notable historian now in Australia, he won an Indigenous prize for historical writing, even though his stuff's completely fiction, to be honest, when you check the footnotes. is Bruce Pascoe. This is a bloke who his genealogy shows he does not have a single Aboriginal ancestor. It claims to be a member of 3 different tribes. At times he said 5, but 3 different tribes. He's going to be speaking at the Sydney Writers' Festival in a short while. He refuses to say why he still identifies as Aboriginal. He used to say it was through his mother's grandmother, one of his mother's grandmothers, and then admitted she was English. He still hasn't come up with who it is that is Aboriginal. And yet, around the land, he is hailed and announced and promoted as an Aboriginal writer, getting prizes for it. Can you believe it? He's got 2 positions at universities as an Indigenous expert. He looks as white as you do and cannot show a single Aboriginal ancestor, and yet no one dares call him out.
And yet
it's so extraordinary.
Well, I see this morning that he has said he'll undergo a blood test. But I gather there are some conditions attached to it.
Test, to establish DNA, a DNA
test, if you will,
to establish indigeneity.
But
unfortunately, it's a Bruce Pascoe. That's not that Bruce Pascoe. He's a ranger looking at dingo pups. He wants DNA tests to show whether really Australian dingoes or some blow-ins before they know what to do with them. But there you go. Wrong Bruce Pascoe.
So there is another Bruce Pascoe.
There is another Bruce Pascoe.
Well, you see, therein lies the danger of just feeding off a headline, which is what most people do.
Most people do, yeah.
What I read or heard, and I can't remember which now, was that he was willing to undergo a DNA test, but there were conditions, and I hadn't yet found out what those conditions might be.
The conditions are that he wasn't really the same Bruce Pascoe. And it's for a dog. But it's funny that Bruce Pascoe, the historian, so-called historian, I think fabulous is probably more the word, once did write an angry letter, a joint letter, demanding that people who scooped up Indigenous prizes should show proof that they were Indigenous, but apparently that goes by the board now. You don't need that. What the hell? There's all the fact that an Australian academic claims to be of the Wininini tribe. And when I asked her, where is this tribe? I've never heard of it. The magisterial work listing Aboriginal Tribes Australia records no such tribe anywhere. Oh, it was from my father, except it was a stepfather who came into the family when she was about 16. So she's hardly Indigenous, if that was it. And he made up his background as well. So basically, anyone now can claim it, and it doesn't matter. People are so scared of these hate speech laws that anything goes. And
so your advice
is where we are.
Your advice to this country?
Don't do it. I mean, what happened to the joys of debate? What happened to hearing stuff you didn't agree with? Either you learned something from it because they told you something, they exposed flaws in your own thinking, right? Mm-hmm. Or you were comforted with the fact that by arguing back you showed they were an idiot and you were right all along. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that.
Let me quote you something. This is written for anybody's benefit by Olivia Pearson, who I have the utmost admiration for. And I pick up the second paragraph. Our most sacred and inalienable human right has been lined up in the crosshairs, waiting to be shot to hell by Ardern's woke fascist government. The right to, some people will be offended by that, the right to speak freely as prescribed in New Zealand's Bill of Rights. And here's what it says. Everyone has the right to freedom of expression, including the freedom to seek, receive and impart information and opinions of any kind in any form. This cornerstone freedom of our civilization allows us to debate robust ideas of any kind in any manner. Religion, sex, standards of decency, human conduct, economics, immigration, social welfare, technology, science, medicine, and foreign affairs. Our government plans to bastardise that central liberty, in effect to something despicably close to everyone has the right to freedom of expression, except if that expression may be perceived by anyone as an incitement of disharmony based on an intent to stir up, maintain or normalise hatred through threatening, abusive or insulting communications.
Yep. I mean, that same attitude Isn't that exactly what, for instance, had some people once persecuting the Jews? How dare the Jews preach a different God and all this kind of stuff? That's offending these poor old people over here. Get rid of them. It's just every kind of, despotism can be justified with that kind of thing. There are people opposing me. Get rid of them. They're offending me by being richer or smarter or this or that or different in their looks or whatever, It's just so stupid. It is pandering not just to the deliberately offended, I really want to seek offence, that's my bit of power. It's also pandering to the stupid. When you reduce an argument, not to whether you're right or you're wrong, the facts are here, the facts are there, reason, evidence, all that kind of stuff, but to, my feelings have been hurt. When you do that, you're reducing an argument to a field of combat where the most stupid can win. All they need to do is prove that they're offended. That's all. They just need to wail a little, cry a little, show their hurt feelings. End of argument. The other person's in jail or on trial or whatever. They don't need to prove they're right or wrong. It's just brilliant. Morons win. And that's why morons tend to actually argue for this stuff.
You mentioned earlier that I was born in Melbourne, which is, of course, correct. I have asked a few people, and I'm talking about in interviews, a few people the following question, but none of them have given me a suitable answer, a satisfactory answer. So I'm hoping that you will. Mm-hmm. What has happened to the city and the state of my birth? I was gone by the time I was 6, but the state, and I love Melbourne. What has happened to your state that has swung it so far left that they would elect and keep electing someone like Daniel Andrews?
Look, that's such a hard one.
And then before you take off on that, but in accompaniment with that is the education system in Victoria and other aspects of governance that has all swung hard left.
Well, that's true. And part of it is, one, the history of the state is generally more collectivist than, say, New South Wales, which was a traditionally more free trade kind of thing. And these things have history has its weight. There's also, once a government's in power, they have a lot of ability to remake the society in their image. You're seeing what Joe Biden's doing right now. 2 is when and 3 is when you give people lots of benefits and, we're going to protect you, and harp on their fears. That's another thing. You make people make them learn to be helpless and pander to that, which is then begging for collectivist solutions. All those things come into play. And if you've got a hopeless opposition, all that. There's a bit wider element to it, though, I think, and that is conservatives tend to feel, they prize individuality. They don't band together. And that makes them, you need a special kind of courage then if you feel as an individual you're standing up to a collective. Mm-hmm. If you're one against the mob tends to win. And if you don't have conservatives who are prepared to fight and give encouragement to others by example and also by, superior argument and all that, you lose. And that's what we've had, people too weak to really fight. And it's just so
there have been
sad.
Some very good Victorian premiers over the years.
Yes.
Couple of crooked ones too.
No, they took, Jeff Kennett in particular, it served 2 terms, free market, privatising kind of guy, and really set Victoria up. But the abuse he took at the time, really quite extraordinary. So, that's the thing. You need when there's a collective, you don't need to be a leader to be particularly good to lead it. It has its energy of its own. When you're a party of individualists, your leader must be a stamp above the rest. They must have some sort of courage You know, they've got to be a Churchill or a Thatcher or a Reagan, or have some sort of moral clarity and challenge. They can't just be an everyman. Otherwise, they just go with the flow, which is kind of what you're seeing in Australia now. Just go with the flow. The halfway measure, like I'm not as extreme as the left there. I'm not as extreme as the right of my party here. I'm in the middle. So all you need to rule is a yardstick to get the exact middle. You don't need to decide where society could go. You just go in the middle, which means inevitably you go down the stream with everyone else. That's where we are now. That's where Boris Johnson is. It's so sad. It's so sad. And also the other thing, of course, is that Conservatives tended to think, well, we're here for the jobs. We're here for the, hard economic stuff. As a SOP, we'll leave the softer stuff to the left of our party, or the left generally, like education. Yeah, and look what's happened. The march through the institutions starts through the schools.
And it's succeeding very well.
Oh, too well. I feel quite frightened for our future. I really do. Thank God I'm 61 and not 21 confronting this.
Yeah.
I'm
with you. On that particular note, because the front line for the education system, I think you'd agree, is probably climate change.
Yes.
That's the door opener to so many other things. I want to know whether the sea level has risen noticeably on Mount Martha Beach over the last 50, 60 years.
Look, I haven't gone out with a stick to measure it, but I don't think any homes slid into the sea. There have been sea level rises. I mean, there's been a warming of the planet for 150 years.
Oh, sure.
So that's well before. And there's been some small rise. What I find really interesting is, you remember Al Gore, in Inconvenient Truth, said that there were climate refugees fleeing to New Zealand from all these atoll islands that are being inundated. Well, there hasn't been one. There was one guy that tried his luck in a court and got the bum's rush because he was having it on.
Well, you're well briefed.
What I find fascinating is it's actually at University of Auckland, and the guy's not a climate skeptic, Paul Kench. He's been doing fantastic work. It probably is the leading world expert on Pacific rises in sea level in Pacific Islands, and he has found out that low-lying Pacific atoll islands, you think are the most likely to drown, about three times more are increasing in size than decreasing because of coral accretion and all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
There is actually not the drowning island phenomenon that we were told to expect. And New Zealand at least has one scientist, even though he's a believer in global warming, says it's still a threat, blah, 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 has got the integrity, the honesty to puncture that scare.
Well, I'm looking forward to Steve Koonen's book when it comes out in a couple of weeks too.
Mate, I look forward to any sign that people are going to buck this trend, because it's a religion that's got completely out of hand.
And on that note, I want to say thank you so much for your time. It's much appreciated.
It's been a pleasure.
And I've enjoyed the conversation, and I've been quieter than I normally am. Because
enjoy the conversation while we still dare to have one.
You got it. Andrew Bolt, 5 nights a week on Sky News Australia. And let me just tell you, you've got a lot of adherents here in New Zealand, because they keep corresponding with me and saying, when are you going to talk to Andrew Bolt? Well, we've just done it.
Well, that's very kind of them. Thank you very much. And the only thing that I feel sad about New Zealand is I once thought, well, that beautiful coastline, I'd like a little house on one of them, or down near Queenstown or something like that. But, gee, the way your country is going, I think there's no place left that's safe, is there?
At this particular point of time, we need to get our act together, yes.
Yes, at least you've still got Catherine Mansfield. What a great writer that was.
There you go. He can't be all bad. Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it greatly.
Good on you, mate. See you later.
Now into the mailroom we go. Mrs. Producer is waiting. Carolyn, how are you?
Leighton, I'm extremely good as usual, thank you.
Seen very little of you today. You've been out and about and very busy.
Doing chores.
Doing God's work, actually. Now, what have you got?
So this is from Steve. He says, this is the beginning of our next depression, Leighton. A train crash is coming. And he references this piece that's in the Herald. I think it was the Herald, yes. Finance Minister Grant Robertson has proposed giving himself new powers over bank lending. This morning, Robertson revealed the details of the Deposit Takers Bill, which includes details of deposit protection in the event that a bank collapses, with the government guaranteeing deposits of up to $100,000 per eligible institution. While the government has long signalled plans around deposit protection, Thursday's release revealed that Cabinet has agreed to a new process for setting lending restrictions, such as loan-to-value ratios, moving some degree of power from the Reserve Bank to the Beehive. This will give the Minister of Finance a role in determining which types of lending the Reserve Bank is able to directly restrict. The Reserve Bank will then have full discretion to decide which instrument is best suited to use and how the restrictions are applied. And that's what Grant Robertson is saying.
Yes, well, I revert to last week's interview with Richard Prebble, discussion, where he rated Robertson, I think it was 3 out of 10. And I think we'll just leave it there because I've had a couple of other opinions voiced to me this week with regard to their concern. Speaking of Richard Prebble, I've never met Richard Prebble, writes William, but have seen him on TV many times and have never warmed to him. Not the only person to say that, actually. But I certainly warmed to him when I heard your last podcast and made a couple of notes to write to you. I did the same with Des Gorman. I really enjoy the erudition and eloquence of most of your guests when they discuss important matters. Then, on the Andrew Bolt show, I saw Manaya Mahuta delivering her Dragon Taniwha speech and raised another important matter. Then I began to think of other less important matters, and he goes into a bit of an off-course tangent. All this just began as a note to say how much I enjoy your podcast and also to draw your attention to a professor I heard on the Bolt show. His name is Professor Richard Linsden, and I felt he would be most interesting if you could interview him. He seems to know what he's talking about and seems to have been verified by his contemporaries. Seems to have been vilified by his contemporaries. William, let me put it to you a different way. Linsden has very few contemporaries, if we understand contemporaries in its proper sense. There are very few who can match him with his knowledge, his experience, and his ability. Maybe that's why they're vilifying him, because they don't like what he says because he doesn't fall into line. He's been around a long time. He's getting on a bit, but it's the older, more experienced professionals who see the truth for what it is, not what we're being sold. There you go.
Can you please pass on to Leighton how much I enjoyed his Herald column this morning? It was absolutely spot on, and thank goodness someone is talking about this. I'm also appalled by the increasingly woke and sycophantic local media, and it is time for an honest debate about the state of the media and commentary here and worldwide. Thank goodness we still have Leighton.
That's very nice.
And that's from an ex-journalist.
Dear ex-journalist, thank you. I appreciate it very much. I'm glad you appreciated it and enjoyed it. The column that is referred to was a critique of the media, American and elsewhere, including New Zealand, with some suggestions, and backed up, by the way, by some pretty good high flyers in the journalism world. So I was hoping that you would be open to a suggestion of someone to bring on your podcast. He is lighting up the internet at the moment, Dr. Mike Yaden, former Vice President of Pfizer, and was Chief Science Officer in charge of respiratory R&D for 16 years there. He now owns his own biotech firm. New Zealand media are deliberately hiding opposing scientific opinion like they do with climate change, and Kiwis deserve to hear what people like Mike, who is more qualified than any scientist in Australasia to comment on this issue, have to say. And in the context of who Mike is and what he says about these current mRNA vaccines and the state of the lies behind the data surrounding the COVID is jaw-dropping. He's very receptive to interviews as well. I did look him up, and I found out that he started up his own. He left Pfizer, started up his own and then sold it, I believe, in 2018. Now, I might not have that straight, but that's what I remember seeing. But I'll take it a little further.
The long-awaited verdict against the cop who killed George Floyd would have more significance if the protests were to acknowledge that all lives matter, not just one ethnicity. I'm still waiting for some reaction to the death of a British Kiwi cop who was shot dead in a UK police station by an arrested person who was obviously not held securely by the officers holding him. Will nobody make a protest against the killer of the innocent officer who died doing his job protecting us? Somehow I believe I will be waiting a long time to see the right thing done. That's from Bob.
Bob, the only thing I want to add is that if they publish the number of police in America who get killed doing their duty, fulfilling their obligation to society, there might be a few people who would maybe reverse their decisions. I don't have the number at hand, but I know it's substantial. From somebody who wants to remain anonymous, my view on the Chauvin case, I don't really care either way, to be honest. If the police officer has done wrong, then he's done wrong, Gov. However, as you know, I've taught this sort of unarmed combat, also restraint stuff to police, Army, SF, etc. I saw a non-trivial crowd bystander situation that for all the officers involved could have been extremely problematic. You'll recall the ambulance didn't hang around, took Mr. Floyd away for a few blocks before stopping to work on him. Controlling someone large, 6'3" if I recall correctly, and uncooperative like Mr. Floyd, who was off his face, is hard enough at the best of times. Using your knee in that way frees up your hands. For example, if you need to draw your firearm. And using good posture means that you have good situational awareness. Pressure is important as it keeps them on the floor. Similar techniques are even in their training handbooks. The real issue for me, not being a lawyer, is that all the jurors came from the state. One of them from the same city as Mr. Floyd. The New York Times did a pretty good job of mostly doxing the jurors without doxing them, if you get my drift. There's no way they didn't know about that. These people were not sequestered for the entire trial, and they would have known full well what the result would be, or would have been, for America, their states, their cities, and for them and their families. You will recall that pig's blood was thrown at the former house of one of the defence experts. That the jury took only 10 hours to deliberate after weeks of complex evidence is, for me, also interesting. Senator Maxine Waters and her mates mouthing off before the result was nothing short of a threat, and Biden, well, all after the judge had asked everyone to behave. A couple of others too. I note the left are banging on about racism, etc. now. Well, during the trial, this was never mentioned once by the prosecution. So political race baiting at its finest currently underway. I reckon there'll be an appeal, and I reckon he'll get his appeal, though again, I'm not a lawyer.
From Paul Leighton. Hi, Leighton. Mark Levin is asking free-thinking people to fight back to preserve America's founding principles. Having been a listener to your show for many years, I'm certain you agree with him. The founding fathers built the bus of freedom and by extension gifted it to all of us. I long for the day when someone gets Jacinda Ardern on a media platform and asks some fundamental questions on the freedom we enjoy in New Zealand and where it comes from.
Mm-hmm. Mark Levin, an American broadcaster of some considerable note. I think probably most people are aware of his name at the very least. I have thought of inviting him on the podcast, but decided against it for a couple of reasons. One is this. You may not know what he does, how hard he works. He apparently gets by on about 3 hours sleep a night. He's writing his next book. He's written 8 already. He's writing his next book. And every spare moment he spends on that. He does a 3-hour, 5-night-a-week radio broadcast. He does virtually every night online. He does a television program. And he does on Sunday nights, American time, he does Life, Liberty and Levin. Works his butt off. And apart from that, he does other things too. So my guess is he'd say, appreciate it, but thanks, no thanks.
You'd be lucky if you got a reply by the sound of it.
Exactly. Anyway, that's it from me. Oh, no, it's not. A quick note from Richard. Every New Zealander should watch this. None will. Now, I can't show you, and I can't give you an address, but I can steer you into it. It's Jordan Peterson's critique of the Communist Manifesto. There is a short attached article written by Jordan Peterson on April 19, 2019. I don't get that. I debated Marxist philosopher Slavoj Zizek in Toronto. Oh, I get it. April 19 at the Sony Centre. I started with a critique of the Communist Manifesto, which is the central revolutionary document of the Marxist movement. Dr. Zizek is a Slovenian philosopher and professor at the Institute for Sociology and Philosophy at a university I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, whose work on cultural studies, psychoanalysis, and above all, for the purposes of our debate, Marxism are world-renowned. The topic, happiness, Marxism versus capitalism. Happiness, Marxism and capitalism is a no competition. Game's over before it starts. Thank you, Mrs. Producer.
Welcome.
I appreciate your attendance. You may, I don't know.
I'm off.
Go and do something.
Thank you very much for your...
But I've got more to say.
Of course you have.
And now what we call the guest column of the week. And before the guest column of the week this week, there is a prelude column of the week. Don't worry, it's not going to be irregular, but it sets it up beautifully for where we're going. What is post-truth? You have a pretty good idea what it is, don't you? Most people do, I think. Post-truth, after-truth, what follows truth, whatever. Every year, the Oxford Dictionary chooses a word of the year. At the end of 2016, they announced, after much discussion, debate and research, the Oxford Dictionary's word of the year of 2016 is post-truth, an adjective defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. They continue, the concept of post-truth has been in existence for the past decade, but Oxford Dictionaries has seen a spike in frequency this year in the context of the EU referendum in the United Kingdom and the presidential election in the United States. It has also become associated with a particular noun, in the phrase post-truth politics. Now, in our current series, we've been highlighting exactly how our society became post-truth. During the modern era, 1650 to 1967, we pursued truth believing it would create utopia. However, I didn't know that truth was actually leading to utopia, but apparently so. However, people soon began fighting over what truth was. In 1967, or by 1967, after many wars over competing truth claims, people became so exasperated that we had a cultural revolution and decided to abandon the pursuit of truth entirely. In the new postmodern era, which is 1967 till now, we decided that we didn't need or want truth anymore. All we needed now was love. In other words, we rejected the hard-right conservative virtues and decided to pursue the soft-left liberal virtues instead. This is the simple reason why we now live in a post-truth society. This is why presently, as the Oxford Dictionary puts it, objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. As our culture becomes more liberal, increasingly driven by the heart than the head, we increasingly are shaped by emotion rather than objective facts. Indeed, we increasingly hate the truth for its divisive nature. We call it hate speech. We call people who speak it bigots. So to the column of the week, written by James Innes-Smith and published by Spectator. How to apply for a post-truth position, as in a job. Anyone over the age of 35 would be advised to hire a translator before rifling through the job section of The Guardian. Looking for a role in education? You'll need a first in doublespeak just to understand what it is you're applying for. When I clicked on a listing for an infrastructure support officer, not something I do very often, admittedly, I was assailed by a tsunami of comprehensive, personalised, integrated safeguarding of frameworks and best practices masquerading as a vibrant and cooperative environment in which to work. Having read the listing several times, I'm still no wiser as to what sort of infrastructure I would be supporting, or why I'd need to be paid £75,000 a year for the privilege. I can't work out whether the obfuscation in these listings is deliberate or just good old-fashioned idiocy. Whoever writes this guff, and I'm assuming it's the same person because it all sounds the same, is so mired in corporate speak that they seem incapable of composing sentences that convey a semblance of meaning. You'd think a university of all places would insist on lucidity around matters of employment, but read any recruitment listing for educational staff and chances are you'll be tearing your eyeballs out in despair. Some positions are so devoid of substance that the ad simply reiterates the title in ever more mangled ways. Take this gem for Head of Wellbeing at the Fashion Retail Academy, a listing that sounds as though it's been penned by a short-circuiting android. The Head of Wellbeing will be responsible for the provision of a comprehensive, inclusive, personalised and integrated student learning and wellbeing support service that includes, but is not limited to, wellbeing, counselling, coaching, additional learning support and safeguarding. As far as I can tell, all that's really required from the successful candidate is the ability to be nice to students. Even I could take it upon myself to be nice at $55,000 per annum. Maybe I should apply. I'm also thinking of responding to Fife College, who are looking to recruit an ambitious, innovative and energetic Director of Student Experience, which will oversee the delivery of a first-class and successful learning experience. But can someone please explain what contributing to the college's strategic and operational planning and performance reporting regime, including effective leadership of the Directorate's planning and performance, actually means? Answers to the head of recruitment, please. It isn't only the education sector pushing these incomprehensible employment opportunities. Legions of post-truth positions are being filled every day, either to make companies feel good about themselves or to gain vital social justice credit points. Maybe a bit of both, eh? Never one to miss out on the zeitgeist. Even the Church of England is putting skin in the game. The Bishop of York recently advertised for a Chief of Staff, paid £90,000 to be a chief companion, support and critical friend. Clearly, it wasn't pointed out to the bishop that even the most principled employee might struggle to be critical when pocketing 3 times the annual salary of a parish priest. Surely the professionalisation of niceness has reached a saturation point. Should my applications to the above positions fail, I could always try my luck in the burgeoning diversity jobs industry. The prestigious Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, where Laurence Olivier and Judi Dench trained, is currently looking for an equality, diversity and inclusion manager who'll be paid £45,000 a year. According to the listing, the successful candidate will need a relevant degree qualification. At last, gainful employment for all those critical race theory graduates. The ad goes on to state that our mission is contingent on a diverse and inclusive student and staff body, bringing richness, knowledge, innovation, new understandings and skills. Note the use of the plural understandings. This is very much in line with modern progressive parlance. A singular new understanding would imply that understanding is non-binary, which of course is discriminatory to all those other forms of understanding. As we begin to confront the economic straits of the pandemic, these post-truth careers seem increasingly superfluous. Perhaps the painful road to recovery will return us to a time when salaries are awarded for work that is useful and restore some sense to the job market. Now, I feel obliged to suggest to Mr. James Innersmith, the author, that he's dreaming. With that last comment, before anything can improve, we have to go through the post-truth period. But I think all of us after that are now probably better armed to wander around the aisles of the supermarket of our choice and discuss quite loudly post-truth prices. And we shall return next week with podcast number 109. Till then, thank you so much for listening. Have a great week and take care.
Thank you.